Look around and it's clear Christianity is incredibly divided. Worldwide, there are an astonishing 45,000 denominations, many of them teaching contradictory doctrines. It's those doctrines and differing ideas about authority in religion that led to most of the fractures in the first place. It all flies in the face of what Jesus prays for in John 17, just before his crucifixion. I'm praying not only for these disciples, but also for those who will ever believe in me through their message. I pray they will all be one, as you and I are one, and may they be in us so the world will believe you sent me. May they experience such perfect unity that the world will know you love them as much as you love me. For Jesus, unity and love were a package deal. So no wonder so many people look at the church today and say, "Look at all that arguing and how they treat each other. Why would I want anything to do with that?" Sadly, much of that strife is here to stay. But we can learn some powerful lessons for our own time by looking at how Jesus handled religious division in his day. So let's start with an overview of the first century, as described in the New Testament. When Jesus walked the earth, the Jewish leaders were divided among three main sects. Each had different religious and political ideas that in turn divided the country's population. Ironically, it was the Roman occupation that brought everything to a head. Some of the Jewish leaders wanted to rebel against the enemy, and others argued for leaving well enough alone. Each side was convinced only they understood Scripture and the one true God, and they had nothing but contempt for the other side. At the very top of the social ladder was the Jewish high priest and his allies, the Sadducees. Their name meant the righteous ones. Sadducees were wealthy and influential noblemen born into their positions. They controlled the temple, which was the religious, political, and economic heart of the entire nation. Each year, hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims flooded Jerusalem's markets to buy sheep, wheat, wine, and oil, all of it for religious sacrifices. The people spent freely because those sacrifices were the major way of worshiping God. Once they were inside the temple, the people turned their offerings over to the priests because they were the only ones allowed to mediate between God and humans. During special feasts like Passover, thousands upon thousands of offerings were made. Those sacrifices were not only of great religious significance, they were also the source of immense wealth and power for the Sadducees. So the religious aristocrats made a deal with the Romans, saying that if the invaders didn't interfere with the workings of the temple, they'd help the occupiers keep peace in the city. Like those early Sadducees, there are churches today who let money dictate their priorities, practices, and even their politics. We need to make sure the focus stays on faith and faithfulness, and that money is just a tool we use to further the work and the will of God. The church is not about real estate, bank accounts, and political power. It's about love and helping others. So when the first Christians raised money, it was to serve the poor, not themselves. But from the beginning, there were many Jews who considered the Sadducees traitors and sellouts who had compromised their faith solely for personal benefit. One of those groups was the Essenes. They were a splinter group of the Sadducees, but they withdrew to the wilderness, convinced the Sadducees were entirely corrupt. They called themselves the Sons of Light. Everyone else, including the other Jewish leaders, were the sons of darkness. Though this group isn't named in the New Testament, Jesus would have known their teachings, which were all about ritual purity and the end of the world. To the Essenes, it was incomprehensible that God would allow the Romans to control their land unless he were about to do something remarkable. And in their mind, that remarkable event was the end of days, the apocalypse, the coming of the Messiah, who would make all things right and throw out the Romans. So the Essenes rejected sex and personal possessions, determined to live as perfectly as possible, undistracted by desire. There were about 4,000 of them, and they believed passionately in the immortality of the soul, unlike the Sadducees, who rejected the notion of any kind of afterlife. So the Essenes spent much of their time making copies of the Hebrew Bible and other sacred texts to make sure God's wisdom would survive what they expected to be a final 40-year battle between good and evil. They were especially drawn to the book of Daniel, which promised an eternal reward to the righteous. They stored their writings in caves dotting the cliffs above the Dead Sea, and they were right about two things: an epic battle was on the way, and their writings would survive. We know them today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, there are lots of Christians just like those early Essenes. They retreat into their churches and turn them into modern-day monasteries where there's very little contact with unbelievers. Instead, Jesus calls us to be love, light, and leaven in a world that desperately needs God's mercy, forgiveness, and influence. We need to spread the gospel and be the ambassadors or direct representatives of Jesus himself. But we should share the focus of the Essenes on the coming of the Messiah. When Jesus returns, the dead will rise. Then, together with them, Paul says, we who are still alive and remain on the earth will be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Then we will be with the Lord forever. So encourage each other with these words. But encouragement was hard to find in the first century. The nation was deeply divided. The Romans were exacting heavy taxes and oppressing the people, and everything seemed totally out of control. And out of the chaos came the Pharisees. Above everything else, they considered themselves scholars. They pored over the scriptures, trying to learn how to live righteously. The Pharisees were spiritual separatists who thought the Sadducees had been corrupted by the world. Their name means the separated ones, and they considered themselves purer than the other factions. And they too got some things right. Their leader was a man named Hillel. He didn't care who was running the nation because his ultimate goal was to help people honor God and treat others with justice and compassion, as the Bible said. He taught that every person's first responsibility was to see the image of God in oneself, and then to recognize it in others so that all might love and value every individual. Renouncing his family's wealth, Hillel chopped wood half of each day to support himself and spent the other half studying the Bible. Unlike the Sadducees, Hillel and his Pharisees didn't think you had to be a priest to communicate with God. You could do that through Scripture. But whereas the Sadducees focused on the authority of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pharisees held to the authority of the entire Old Testament, plus the oral law, the Jewish traditions and interpretations passed down from generation to generation. They also believed in angels, miracles, and an afterlife, all of which the Sadducees rejected. So while those rich and influential Sadducees ruled the temple and had the support of the elite, the Pharisees controlled the synagogue where ordinary Jews met to study and learn, and they were supported widely by the common people. But unlike the Essenes, Hillel and the Pharisees didn't withdraw from the world, they tried to figure out how to live in it faithfully, an approach later shared by a young carpenter named Jesus. We see that in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Listen to his practical, day-to-day theology.
Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy.
It's interesting that in Matthew 23, Jesus endorses the authority of the Pharisees. He says, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you."
But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
And there's another confrontation in Mark chapter 7.
The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them."
So Jesus doesn't quibble over their theology, just their hypocritical example, their legalistic devotion to the letter of the law instead of the spirit, and their tendency to avoid big issues while getting bogged down in trivial traditions. The same thing happens today, whenever we take such a legalistic view of Scripture that we see only the rules instead of the ruler. And sometimes we often engage in behavior that's downright hypocritical. So we need to do what Jesus says and practice what he preaches, putting our focus on the things that really matter, like love, mercy, and justice, not our churchy traditions and customs. It's good and it's necessary to study the Bible, but knowledge and doctrine can never become more important than our love and relationship with the God who wrote the book on love. Love God with all your heart. Treat others the way you want to be treated. That's the essence, and if we do that, it'll stave off hard-hearted legalism, self-righteousness, and worship of the Bible instead of its author. But that did not happen in the time of Jesus. The religious establishment as a whole saw him as a threat, especially the 70-member Sanhedrin or Supreme Council. It had members from both the Sadducees and the Pharisees, though the Sadducees were the majority. Those two sides clashed often, but they set aside their differences when it became clear Jesus was undermining their power and control and could bring about a Roman crackdown. They worked together to have him killed. And that's ironic because Jesus was the very Messiah the Pharisees and Essenes were waiting for. But like most Jews, both groups wanted a military Messiah, So while they waited for God to deliver the nation and accomplish something stunning, they missed the whole thing. God did send the Anointed One to redeem the world, not from the Romans, but from sin. "My kingdom is not of this world," Jesus told his followers, but the Jewish elite wanted him gone, so they trumped up charges that Jesus was a king planning an earthly revolt against Rome. Pontius Pilate finally gave in and had him crucified. But ultimately, division destroyed the entire nation. From day one, rebels belonging to a group called the Zealots launched attacks on the Romans from their strongholds in deserts and mountains. These zealous ones, though vastly outnumbered by the Roman legions, were convinced that if they fought bravely enough, God would give them a miraculous victory over the invaders, just as he did in Old Testament times. And to combat these rebels, Rome appointed a vicious and ambitious Arab prince called Herod, who was named King of the Jews. When the rebels tried to topple him, he slaughtered them without mercy. But when King Herod died in 4 BC, the Zealots stepped up their attacks on Roman soldiers and wealthy Jews who worked with the occupiers or enslaved the poor. When the rebels freed slaves, those slaves often joined the Zealot cause. The Romans considered the Zealots bandits, but the common people admired them. By about 50 AD, the Zealots took their attack directly to Jerusalem. A new bunch called the Sicarii started to attack anyone who collaborated with the Romans, including the wealthy Sadducees. They got their name from the long, sharp dagger they used to stab Roman soldiers and Jewish traders in isolated or crowded places. The assassins even killed the high priest, then moved on to wealthy merchants and the influential elite. Finally, the emperor decided enough was enough and made a huge mistake by doing the only thing that could unite all the Jewish factions. He ordered an attack on Jerusalem and the Holy Temple in 68 AD. After some early success by the Jews, the Romans besieged the city, set it ablaze, and burned the temple to the ground, just as Jesus had predicted. And because the Sadducees were so centered on the temple, they quickly disappeared from the scene once their focal point was gone. The Essenes, too, petered out when things didn't work out the way they expected, and Rome was victorious. Instead, it was the Pharisees and their synagogues who carried Judaism forward and spread it around the world. Even today, the teachings of the Pharisees are the core of the Jewish faith. When you look at the situation all around Jesus, it's easy to see why he said, "A kingdom divided by civil war will collapse, and a family splintered by feuding will fall apart." That's a powerful lesson for the church, at a time when it's fighting for its very existence in many parts of the world. Yes, we need to stand up for what we understand to be the truth, but always with love, humility, and gentleness, without demonizing those who don't line up with us in every detail or refusing to work with them. We want the church to grow, but you can't multiply and divide at the same time.